Today is Tuesday, May 20th, 2025. This is Quick Start from CBN News. I'm Dan Andros. President Trump is trying to put an end to the Russia-Ukraine war with some high-stakes talks. We'll have that top story and more on today's podcast, where we bring you news from a Christian perspective. Don't forget, if you haven't done it already, we'd love it if you'd just subscribe, of course, but then also leave a rating. Just click the star. You don't have to write anything, but give us a rating there on your podcast platform of choice. We'd appreciate that. You can always email us as well. We love hearing from you. quickstartpodcast@cbn.org. That's our email address. Joining me today to get through all the news that's going on, Madison Seals, Trey Goins-Phillips. A lot to get to, as always. On the focus story, Madison, the Department of Education has dropped its record-setting fine against a Christian university.
Yeah, and this decision comes just weeks after Trump's anti-Christian bias task force heard about the school's case. So this news should be encouraging to Christians all over the country who may be in similar situations, but ultimately defended by this new administration.
All right, details on that coming up here in just a minute. On the main thing, President Trump has moved to ease sanctions on Syria. We'll break down what this means going forward on the main thing. All right, make sure you subscribe to all of our CBN News podcasts. You got Billy's Newsmakers podcast, full-length interviews each and every day. Make sure you're checking that out. Also, Abigail Robertson from CBN, her Heaven Meets Earth podcast, new episodes on Mondays. So one dropped yesterday. Make sure you're checking that out as well. You can find the links to those podcasts in the description of this Quick Start podcast episode. All right, we're going to head over to the news now in 90 seconds. And President Trump says a ceasefire process between Russia and Ukraine will begin immediately. This after a 2-hour call with Vladimir Putin. Trump described the tone of the call as excellent and said both sides agreed to enter peace talks, with the Vatican offering to host. Trump also spoke with Zelensky and several European leaders to relay the outcome. Putin, for his part, said he's open to a peace memorandum, but emphasized the need to resolve what he calls the, quote, root causes, end quote, of the war. Ukraine remains skeptical, especially since Moscow continues to demand Kyiv give up territory and reject NATO. The call follows last week's failed peace summit in Istanbul. And Israel's new military campaign, dubbed Gideon's Chariots, is now underway, with strikes expanding in Gaza and what Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu calls a dual mission: defeat Hamas and free the remaining hostages. Nighttime explosions have rocked Gaza as IDF forces continue to press forward, while the humanitarian role is rising. Israeli officials say the operation is isolating Hamas leadership and dismantling its strongholds. President Trump has denied, meanwhile, any rift with Netanyahu, saying that he's angry and he has every right to be. October 7th was one of the worst atrocities in modern history, not just for Israel, but for the world. Those are just some of today's top headlines. You can check out more stories over at cbnnews.com. And it's an interesting dynamic, guys, that President Trump is really trying to end the Ukraine-Russia war. Obviously, with Israel, we've long supported Israel. They're ramping things up right now, in large part because Hamas just refuses to give these hostages back. But you do see a concerted effort by this administration to try to really push for peace in all these different regions of the world where there's been historical and lots of conflict.
Yeah, I think the negotiations regarding Ukraine are interesting because Trump had made that such a huge campaign promise, right? He said, if I was president, this war never would have broken out. I kept Putin in check during my first administration. So now this is kind of when the chickens are going to come home to roost, or at least Trump, I'm sure, hopes they do, right? He wants to be successful in actually brokering a deal that will result with the ratcheting down of this conflict between Russia and Ukraine. So these back and forths and these updates, obviously Trump is always going to say how incredibly well and beautiful and wonderful the meetings he has go, because that's just his personality. But we'll see as time goes on. Are these conversations actual negotiations that are going to end up with some real life results, or are they just, diplomatic nothing? It's just going to kind of go nowhere. So we'll see. And as far as what's going on in Israel, That's interesting too, because we may want there to be peace. We may want it to kind of ratchet down there, but of course Israel's going to protect their land. They're not going to back away if they don't see a benefit in backing away, right? They want to make sure that their land is protected first and foremost.
Right. And that may be part of the reason that there was talk of kind of a rift between Netanyahu and Trump after this last hostage release, because there was a little bit of a difference in, I guess, the celebration, the way that it was celebrated between Trump and Netanyahu. Of course, everybody saw it as a victory, but I think there was more of a, this is a huge victory by Trump, whereas Netanyahu saying, we're still in the middle of this. Let's not get too excited yet. There's a lot more work to do. So, yeah, it'll be interesting to see what happens in that case. But like you were saying, Trey, these conversations always seem pretty rosy on both sides. At least that's how it sounds as it's reported. But I think it's encouraging to hear, at least from Russia, Putin signaled that it was informative, but very frank. And it seems like at least that's one thing that's happening with these international negotiations is there's a level of respect for our president and our administration now that didn't exist before.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely some truth to the fact that Trump was saying that, because when you look at his administration, these other nations did not feel comfortable taking these actions while Trump was in office the first time. And it didn't happen until the next administration came in. So maybe a coincidence, or maybe, just maybe, the guy that they're a little worried about with his finger on the red button is in office, that maybe they won't be so aggressive. But he inherited these things, and he's working on trying to go ahead and get these things buttoned up. And so we'll see what kind of progress he makes. And of course, we're praying for these conflicts to die down and to ultimately go away. Nobody really wants those in the first place. So hopefully that's the trend line that we're on, but we'll see where it goes from here. Keep reporting on it at cbnnews.com. All right. We are going to head to the focus story now. And as we mentioned at the top there, the Department of Ed there is dropping this record-setting fine against a Christian university. So tell me about the update here, Madison.
Yeah, so Grand Canyon University, which has become the largest Christian college here in the U.S., was fined back in 2023 by the Department of Education for $37.7 million, which was the largest fine imposed by the department on a university. And the fine alleged that Grand Canyon had misrepresented the cost of its doctoral programs and quoted students a lower price than what apparently 98% of the program's graduates ended up actually paying. And the Department of Education claimed that they did this to attract more students to enroll. But the university denied that and said it hasn't misrepresented the time or the cost of the programs. And they offer a pretty prominent disclosure on their webpage with its program cost calculator that they believe is actually more extensive than what other universities offer. So over the next year and a half, that's what they argued. Grand Canyon fought the fine and other federal penalties that they had gotten. And they said the government unjustly targeted the school for what they said were political or ideological reasons that they don't understand.
So why did the Department of Education, what they say the reasoning was for them to ultimately drop the fine?
Yeah, well, this update is big news because it comes within weeks of President Trump's first meeting with the Anti-Christian Bias Task Force that got to hear about this case and others like it to see if they unfairly target Christians in the United States. And the task force met last month, and it consisted of U.S. Attorney General Pam Bondi, faith office leaders, and fellow Trump cabinet members who all sat down together and listened to conservative Christians with stories of investigations and fines that were imposed under the Biden administration that they believed were unfair and unfairly targeted them and their organizations. And of course, there were representatives from the two largest Christian colleges in the U.S., so Grand Canyon and Liberty University, who were both targeted by the Biden administration. And after 18 months of disputing Grand Canyon's fine that was issued under the Biden administration, the Department of Education's appeals office dismissed the case finally with no findings, fines, liabilities, or penalties of any kind. So basically said none of the original fine should have even existed.
So when we look at this update, and as obviously as Christians, this looks like a good update. Is this sort of like an isolated thing that we should be looking at, or perhaps is this signaling to a bigger shift in how cases like this that we saw pop up in the last administration against Christian universities? Are we going to see a bigger shift here, or is this kind of like an isolated kind of incident?
It definitely seems, just by the presence of how many university officials showed up at this meeting and other Christian or conservatives who showed up, that this is not isolated. And there has been a growing number of cases just over these past 4 years of people who believe that they're being unfairly targeted for their Christian beliefs. And so I think this is important because, like I said, for the past 4 years especially, Christian organizations, not just universities, and even churches have been targeted with these outrageous fines and restraints that seem to unfairly outweigh the treatment of non-Christian organizations or universities. So in some cases, maybe the fine to a level was deserved, or maybe there was some sort of penalty needed. But in a lot of these cases, that fine far outweighed what another university that's not a Christian university would have received. And what multiple speakers pointed out in this meeting is that these seem to be attempts to harm a university or other organization that individuals in these agencies are ideologically opposed to. And even a Wall Street Journal editorial speculated that the oversight might be from progressive regulators who don't like to see enrollment on the rise at a conservative Christian school. So I think that's an important point to make too. And, this isn't hard to believe. As we talk about all the time, Christians and people who hold conservative values will be faced with opposition because these values are in direct contrast with progressive policies. But this becomes a problem of religious discrimination when those people are fined or restrained from doing their work for no other reason than holding to their Christian beliefs. And that's the reason I think this task force exists, is to protect religious liberty and Christians in the United States, which is something that everyone should be able to get behind.
Yeah, I mean, and the irony here is that I think when you mention those progressive ideas and the Christian ideas that sort of butt heads, the irony there is that it's essentially a religious belief on their part. When you look at it, they have these set of sort of holy things that they hold dear and that they are pillars of their faith. And that's why when you see Christians come in, and of course our views are different than those by and large, then there's this competition. And so they look at it as hearsay and you got to get it out of there. And when you look at the last administration, you mentioned that disproportionate enforcement, and it's about 70% of the Department of Education's actions under Biden. So anytime it took an action, 70% of those were directed at Christian colleges, even though those kind of colleges enroll less than 10% of the total U.S. college students. So in Grand Canyon being in that example. And so you look at that and you're kind of like, what's up with that? It almost seems intentional. And then you look at the actions like we've reported on Mark Houck and these pro-lifers that get these crazy sentences and these fines and whatnot. And you're wondering what's going on here. And it certainly seems like this is going to be a welcome change of pace under this new Department of Education.
Yeah, I mean, for sure. There's no doubt, at least in appearance, that these are intentional attacks on specifically Christian institutions, right? I mean, Grand Canyon University is either one or two as far as the largest Christian university. Grand Canyon and Liberty University are always kind of neck and neck. So they're the two biggest evangelical Christian universities in the country. It seems obvious that they were a target of attacks and have been a target of attacks in previous administrations. And I remember just a couple months ago, guys, we were talking about this new task force. Is this just going to be a propaganda play, or is it actually going to be talking about this task force in the Trump administration, or is it going to be something that has some teeth to it that's actually going to go after organizations or not organizations, go after these previous rulings on organizations? And it seems like they are, right? It seems like they're actually working to alleviate some of this bias that's been in place now for at least the last 4 years under the previous administration. So that's encouraging to hear. It is frustrating, like you were saying, Madison, that these attacks happened in the first place, but it's great to see that there's now a pendulum swing of accountability now, I hope.
Yeah, absolutely. Madison, final thoughts on this before we go?
Yeah, I agree. I think that this speaks highly of a lot of the work that this new administration is doing and clearing out unnecessary government agencies. I mean, even like you were saying, Dan, Christian universities are not making up the majority of where students attend in the United States, and yet 70% of the cases are wrapped up in them, which means there's been so much just speculation and interrogation and just a lot of focus on those when maybe there could have been focus on what public universities were doing or what they were wasting time or money on. So
Yeah.
I think this is good for a lot of reasons.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks for breaking it down on the podcast today, Madison. Appreciate it. Obviously, an important update there. And like we said, hopefully a trend in a positive direction coming on that front here. So we're going to head over to the main thing now. And Joel Veldkamp, who's head of international communications at Christian Solidarity International, is praising President Donald Trump's pledge to ease Syrian sanctions while also offering a caveat. He joined Billy to explain on today's main thing.
Joel, appreciate you coming on today. A lot of news coming out of the Middle East right now, particularly when it comes to America and our role on the global stage. Now, President Donald Trump, he has essentially pledged to end sanctions against Syria. Before we get into all of the issues around that, what are those sanctions? What has the impact of them been?
Yeah, the impact of the sanctions has been really devastating, Billy. The U.S. and its allies imposed these sanctions on Syria in 2011, just as the civil war between the dictatorship of Bashar al-Assad and the rebel coalition led by al-Qaeda-linked jihadists was beginning. And supposedly the goal of the sanctions was to either punish the Syrian government for its crimes against the Syrian people or pressure them into a diplomatic solution. But the effect was really to devastate the country. I actually lived in Syria for a year before the war started, and it was not a rich country, but it was a middle-income country. It was a country with a middle class. Today, over 90% of Syrians live in poverty. Over 500,000 Syrian kids are shorter than they should be because malnutrition has got so bad in Syria. And a lot of that is directly attributable to the sanctions.
And the goal of the sanctions obviously seemed to be to knock the regime out, get new power in Syria. Would you say that that's an accurate assessment of why this went on for so long?
It seems to have been. The civil war in Syria was really a proxy war between the U.S. and Russia. And for a long time, it seemed like Russia had won because they supported the Syrian government, and the Syrian government really seemed to have won the day. But of course, the Syrian government collapsed in December. And as President Trump said in Riyadh yesterday when he made this announcement, the sanctions seemed to have served their function. So if we take the president's word seriously, the function of the sanctions was to bring about regime change in Syria to the U.S.'s liking.
Now, Christian Solidarity International, you guys have long advocated for pulling back on these sanctions, but right now you're also warning, and feel free to fill in any of the blanks here, that there need to be some protections that are baked into any sort of rescindment of these sanctions because of the situation on the ground there. Can you explain?
Sure. Well, we're against these broad economic sanctions that target the whole country, that hurt all Syrians, regardless of who they are. And we want those to be removed no matter what. So we're really glad that Trump is taking this step. We've always heard from Christians in Syria that this is an essential step if Christians themselves are going to survive in Syria as a religious group. But the problem is this regime change that the sanctions seem to have been a part of bringing about replaced a brutal dictatorship in Syria with an al-Qaeda-linked dictatorship. The current ruler of Syria, the president of Syria, is the founder of al-Qaeda in Syria. He used to be called Abu Muhammad al-Jolani. Now he goes by the name Ahmed al-Shara. And the U.S. seems to think that they can work with him. But in the last few months, we've seen huge massacres of religious minorities in Syria. We've seen thousands of Alawite Muslims killed on the Syrian coast by pro-government forces. We've seen attacks now on a different community called the Druze, and a lot of the Christians are wondering if they're next. So even as these sanctions get taken away, the U.S. needs to be really focusing on this and really thinking what else they can do to make sure that Christianity is not destroyed in Syria.
As you saw images of President Donald Trump shaking hands with Syrian President Ahmed al-Sharaa, what went through your mind? I mean, that must have been kind of wild to see.
It's completely mind-blowing. For most of the past 14 years, the U.S. has had a $10 million bounty on Ahmed al-Sharaa's head because, as I said, he was the founder of al-Qaeda in Syria. So to see him shaking hands with the American president is just wild. It's not to say that we don't want peace with Syria. We don't want Syria to prosper. Of course we do. So do Christians in Syria. And those are the people that we're advocating for. But President Trump said something very interesting when he made this announcement. He said, he encouraged Syria. He said, good luck, Syria. Show us something special. Do something like Saudi Arabia has done. And that was a very telling moment because Saudi Arabia is a very rich country. It's also a country where every person is required by law to practice only a very extreme kind of Islam. There's no religious freedom in Saudi Arabia whatsoever. In Syria, Christians live there, Druses live there, Alawites live there, and Muslims live there, and mostly in peace, not always without problems. But Syria has been this way for centuries. But right now, Syria is on the way to becoming like Saudi Arabia. We're in danger of losing this diversity, just the fact that Christians have been in Syria for the past 2,000 years. We might be on the verge of losing that if the Trump administration doesn't pay attention.
So you're essentially saying, and perhaps he was talking, Trump, about the finances of it, not the religious liberty of it, right? These are two very different things. And so if you have a wealthy country, and you say, okay, work towards that. But your warning here is that, well, wait a minute, they actually have some religious liberty and freedom despite what's coming potentially. And that could actually be in danger if they followed the full advice and went after the way that Saudi Arabia has structured their own country.
Absolutely. And Saudi Arabia is one of the main backers of the new Syrian government. So if they don't hear some counter voice from the U.S., then they are going to go in that direction and very quickly. So because Ahmed al-Sharaa is a recognized member of al-Qaeda, there are sanctions just on him as a person and on some of his lieutenants. And what our recommendation at CSI is, remove the sanctions that hurt all Syrians, remove the sanctions that affect the whole country, but these individual sanctions on Ahmed al-Sharaa, on his men, ask for something before you remove those. Ask for accountability for the massacres of Alawites and Druses that have happened in Syria. Ask for firm guarantees for religious freedom for Christians in Syria.
Correct me if I'm wrong here, too, because part of the complexity here is you've mentioned some of the attacks on other groups. Christians, we know that Christian persecution around the globe is raging worse than it ever has in history. And you have a situation here where you have this, al-Qaeda head who's now in charge of Syria, essentially, who has said on the record that they're going to respect religious liberty. They're going to respect Christianity. So you have all of these conflicting messages, and actions speak much louder than words. So talk a little bit more about the specific fears for Christians in light. And I know we talked a little bit about this, but I think it's important to really drive this home. If nothing happens here, if there's no accountability, and you have a country that descends into extremism from the top down, what could happen to the Christians there?
Yeah, one possibility is that Syria becomes a place like Iran, for example, where women are not allowed to have their hair uncovered in public, where you can't buy or sell alcohol, where you can't have any manifestation of Christian religion in public, and where under Sharia law, for example, Christians can't testify against Muslims in court, or Christians have to pay more taxes than Muslims. This is how it historically was in Syria under the Ottoman Empire and under the other Islamic empires. But Christians in Syria today are not going to accept this kind of second-class status where they're constantly at risk of being attacked if they show their Christian identity. So if that happens, I think all the Christians of Syria will leave. There is also the potential for mass violence against Christians. That happened during the Syrian civil war. Ahmed al-Sharaa, the new president, his group attacked Christian villages and Christian towns and massacred Christian civilians. And there's no guarantee that won't happen again, especially when we see the violence that's happening against Alawites and Druses.
All right, Billy, appreciate that conversation there. Important stuff. And good insight as to what's going on there with Syria. Appreciate that. All right, that's going to leave us with time on the podcast today for one last thing.
Yeah, we're looking at 2 Peter 3:9, which says, "The Lord is not slow in keeping his promise, as some understand slowness. Instead, he is patient with you, not wanting anyone to perish, but everyone to come to repentance." I think this is the great reminder that God's timing is not ours, which is a difficult lesson, but thank goodness that neither is his level of patience with us in giving grace and mercy that we need every day.
Yeah. Also, just a beautiful reminder of how much God loves us, right? How much he loves his creation, that he wants all of us to know him.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for people who imagine the angry God with the lightning bolts in the sky, I mean, verses like this that show, no, God is much more graceful and patient, loving, and kind with us, more so than we ever deserve as fallen creatures here in a sinful world. But great verse to end the podcast on. As always, get yourself on over to cbnnews.com and faithwire.com for more news from a Christian perspective. Lord willing, that creek don't rise up on us. We'll be back tomorrow with more. God bless. See you then.